We've seen that one prominent issue that gets a lot of discussion in the debate over euthanasia is whether there is a morally significant difference between killing and letting die. We've also seen that even if we accept that some cases of letting die are morally permissible, we still have to decide when it's permissible to let a patient die. The new issue before us is whether physicians are permitted, or in some cases obligated, to assist in the efforts of an individual in hastening his or her own death. This is slightly different from the first issue in that a physician might not be guilty of killing another person when he or she prescribes some lethal dose of medication for the person to take, but might still be morally blameworthy. We have to decide, however, whether the moral wrong here is equivalent to killing, or whether it's worse or better, morally speaking. We begin this discussion with an article by Daniel Callahan. He argues that physicians are not in the business of helping patients end their own lives. He questions 4 arguments often made in favor of such assistance. 1. The priority of individual self-determination and well-being of the patient. 2. The moral irrelevance of the difference between killing and letting die. 3. The supposed lack of evidence showing likely harmful consequences of legalizing euthanasia. And 4. The compatibility of euthanasia and medical practice. One argument for the legalization of euthanasia is that, when possible, people should have the right to determine the time, place, and manner of their deaths. Many people think that this is the most important right, that it epitomizes the right to autonomy. Callahan's worry is that this kind of argument overlooks the fact that someone else is going to have to participate as well. He says, if it were a question of suicide, where a person takes their own life without assistance from another, that principle might be pertinent, at least for debate. But euthanasia is not that limited a matter. The self-determination in that case can only be effected by the moral and physical assistance of another. Even if I have a right to take my own life, what gives someone else the right to assist me in doing this? Callahan thinks that this falls into a class of activities that we have decided are not permissible. For example, some people might be tempted to waive their liberties and willingly become another person's slave. But slavery, he says, is considered a fundamental wrong. We don't allow willing enslavement. Similarly, dueling is a practice in which 2 parties agree to waive their rights to life in exchange for the right to kill the other. Dueling, however, is illegal. Thus, even if a patient is willing to waive his right to life and grant a physician the power to kill him, the physician, according to Callahan, doesn't thereby gain the right to kill the patient. There is a second problem besides this impossibility of waiving one's right to life. Callahan argues that since the physician is a moral agent as well, she will need justification for helping the patient die. But often patients ask for such assistance because they have found life too burdensome and not worth living. The physician, according to Callahan, would need to agree with the patient, however, in the judgment that his life is not worth living. But how can a physician possibly be able to do that? We might ask here whether the second worry is a good one. We might discuss this in class. Thus, since euthanasia involves more than one person, the claim to individual self-determination doesn't settle the issue. When Callahan turns to the second argument for euthanasia, that killing is not necessarily worse than letting die, we see a different argument in favor of the difference thesis. Callahan claims that people who make such arguments mistake causality for culpability. Causality in this context is the direct physical cause of death, while culpability is the attribution of moral responsibility to human actions. First, he claims, when one says that a physician causes a patient's death in both acts of killing and letting die, he overlooks the fact that it's not just the halting of a process, like life support, that brings about death. If I am hooked to a ventilator, but I don't really need it to breathe, and my doctor unhooks the ventilator, I am not going to die, because I'm healthy. So unhooking a ventilator alone is not a cause of death. It's really the underlying condition that requires the ventilator that causes death. But then letting die is not a cause of death and shouldn't be reason for blame. Second, he claims that culpability is a human construct. So a cause, which is a part of nature, cannot be identical to a piece of human guilt. He says, to confuse the judgments of this ethics with the physical causes of death, which is the connotation of the word kill, is to confuse nature and human action. Now we might wonder whether he is the one guilty of mistaking causality for culpability, since many people would claim that if you are the cause of some negative event, and you could have avoided it, and you knew that you would be the cause, then you are responsible for the negative event. Causality isn't identical to culpability, but causally related to it. Finally, Callahan thinks we've come to use the word kill more broadly. He says, a culpable action that permits the real cause of death, the underlying disease, to proceed to its lethal conclusion. His point, after all this, is that people have assumed that if an omission, the ceasing of providing some life-supportive measure, is part of the causal chain leading up to death, then it is on a moral par with a commission, the active step bringing about death. The third argument he considers is a response to an earlier argument, which is that if we legalize euthanasia, then we will have abuses. Things like nephews lying to doctors about their rich aunt's wishes not to be kept on life support, or elderly people who don't want to be burdens, so agree to euthanasia when they don't really want it. The argument in response is that there isn't much evidence to support these speculations. Now, Callahan's response to this argument is the following. 3 consequences seem almost certain in this or any other country. The inevitability of some abuse of the law, the difficulty of precisely writing and then enforcing the law, and the inherent slipperiness of the moral reasons for legalizing euthanasia in the first place. He goes on to provide some evidence for these suspicions, but one gets the feeling that here he's still just speculating. We'll consider this question in class as well. Finally, he considers the argument that euthanasia is compatible with medical practice. This all has to do with what purposes medicine is supposed to serve, and physicians who assist others in dying have forgotten what these purposes are, claims Callahan. Here's a long quote. The great temptation of modern medicine, not always resisted, is to move beyond the promotion and preservation of health. Notice this is the proper purpose of medicine for Callahan. Into the boundless realm of general human happiness and well-being. The root problem of illness and mortality is both medical and philosophical or religious. Why must I die? Can be asked as a technical biological question or as a question about the meaning of life. When medicine tries to respond to the latter, which it is always under pressure to do, it moves beyond its proper role. Now we might ask why a physician isn't supposed to consider the philosophical ramifications of death, since, as Callahan reminded us earlier, she is a moral agent herself. Is she supposed to carve all that away? Now, John Lax thinks Callahan has overlooked some particularities in his account against euthanasia. First, he gives us an idea of what we should be doing as medical ethicists. The function of moral reflection, he says, is to shed light on the difficult problems we face. It cannot perform its job without a clear understanding of how and why certain of our practices come to seem no longer satisfactory. He claims that Callahan has lost sight of the very real problem of suffering and decision-making when he sticks so closely to the abstract. He takes issue with Callahan's claim that physicians are not in the business of offering interpretations of the meaning of existence, that they should stick to treating biological conditions and leave the other stuff to philosophers. Medical professionals have designed the system so that they have to be part of such decisions, Lax argues. When someone, say Sam, is in a terminal situation and wishes to hasten his own death, he has a choice. He could go with one of a number of painful and messy methods, which he doesn't want to do, or ask for drugs. But the medical profession has a monopoly on the drugs. Pharmacies won't dispense drugs without prescriptions, and only licensed care providers can write prescriptions. What is needed, Lax suggests, is a change to the system in which certain individuals can gain access to lethal doses of drugs. Lax also disagrees with Callahan's claim that one cannot pass on a right to take one's life. Callahan, as we saw, claims it's a fundamental wrong, but Lax argues that context and circumstances can actually affect our moral judgment. Another point that Lax makes is that a physician doesn't have to agree with a patient that her life is not worth living in order to assist her in dying. As we saw earlier with Callahan claiming that there needed to be shared values. They must do just as the patients do, he says, and engage in sound reflection. Do some extensive interviewing of friends and family of the patient, and decide whether such a decision seems reasonable for this patient in these circumstances. And finally, Lax thinks Callahan has presented us with a false dichotomy. Either self-determination is absolute, or it is not a reason for legalizing euthanasia. So we can see premise 1 would be either self-determination is absolute or is not a reason for legalizing euthanasia. Premise 2, he argues self-determination is not absolute, right? With his example of slavery and dueling. And then he claims the conclusion would be that it's not a reason for legalizing euthanasia. But as Lax says, of course we don't think that self-determination trumps all other values. But no one thinks that self-determination is absolute. Rapists and murderers shouldn't be freed if they claim that their actions are part of their own autonomy. What we need, he says, is a balanced approach. He says the following: a sensible approach to euthanasia can disclose how much weight autonomy carries in that context and how it can be balanced against other equally legitimate but competing values. So overall, Lax thinks that Callahan has simplified things too much, right? The whole idea of abstract moralizing, in order to be able to give an account, but that the account relies on the oversimplification. If we remove the oversimplification, he says, the account is no longer compelling.